Hey everybody, I'm Sara Gallegos and I'm back with our final Serger Saturday lesson. And today we're going to be talking about one of my very favorite methods for attaching bindings. I do this on almost every single quilt that I make. I love that my sewing machines and my serger are kind of like best friends. They hang out and they play together in my sewing studio here. And adding my bindings with my serger is quick and easy, and I do it, like I said, on almost every single project. So I'm really excited to share it with you. What I have prepared is just a little quilt sandwich that we're going to be binding today. And then I've got my binding strip, and this is a double fold binding strip, just like you probably create for all of your quilts. I like to cut mine 2 1/4 inches. Some people do 2 1/2, and then I folded it wrong sides together, right sides out, and I've also kind of just pressed under one edge, so I've got a nice little finished 45-degree edge to start with. So that's all you need to prep your fabric. Now the other thing that I've got that's sort of unusual here is one of my favorite types of thread. This is from Wonderfil and it is a fusible thread. So you want to make sure that you mark this when you put it in your stash so that you don't accidentally get it mixed up with your other threads, because it will fuse, it's gluey. And it's neat because it literally feels and looks just like a regular spool of thread. Now I've had other fusible threads that were a little bit thicker, but this literally just feels nice and soft and delicate like a regular spool of thread. Now I'm going to place this into my lower looper. So I've already threaded my upper looper and my overlock needle 1. That means that I'm working with a 3-thread overlock wide stitch. And in my needle and my upper looper, I just have regular serger thread. There we go. It's so nice to work with. It blows right through. It's not difficult to thread at all. So again, I've got just regular serger thread in my needle and my upper looper, and we're ready to begin. Now, when I'm working with my bindings, I like to make sure that I've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We covered that in episode 1. So I've got my stitch width set to the letter M because I happen to know that that gives me a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now, just like a normal binding, and I'm working with a pretty small piece here, but I'm gonna line up the raw edges of my binding with the raw edges of my project. And I'm working with the right side facing up, which means I'm going to be turning my binding over to the back. You could do this either way, depending on what your preferred method is. This is how I like to do it. And I'm going to start just a little bit down from where I've left that opening in my binding, and that's going to help me to join the edges. So I'm going to place this right underneath of my presser foot. I'm working with my good old clear foot just because I can see. I really like to work with that. And now I'm going to stitch until I get pretty close to the corner. Okay, so I'm right at the very edge here. I'm almost to the corner. Let me just move my hand there. And what I'm going to do is, normally when you attach a binding with your serger, you pivot a 1/4 inch from the edge, right? Turn it through your fabric 45 degrees and sew off at an angle. We're going to basically replicate that just by sewing off at an angle. So I'm going to stitch, and now I'm going to kind of angle off just like that. And we'll pull that thread out. There we go. And now what I've done is, I think you can see, I've just kind of angled into my corner the ending of my sewing. That's going to allow me to turn a corner just like you would with a normal binding on your sewing machine. So I'm just going to kind of fold that edge right over top of itself. I've got the folded edge of my binding even with the top edge of my project. And now I'm going to run those long edges, those long raw edges together again. And we'll go all the way down to the next corner. And I just kind of finger nudge it together as I go. Move that hand out of the way. And now I'm getting close to that end, so I'm just going to kind of angle off. Here we go. I'll try and do another corner without blocking it quite so much. So again, I've got a nice angle. And then I'm just going to fold that binding over itself. So I'm making that nice 90-degree corner. Now I'm going to place that back under the presser foot. There we go, and stitch down to the next corner. Keeping those edges lined up. So again, I'm just going to pull my binding sort of out of the way so I don't accidentally cut it with the blade. You want to be careful of all this excess because you do have a blade in there. I'm going to sew to the end and just kind of angle off. All right. So we've got one more corner to go. So I'm going to line up that nice edge once again. you could use a little Wonder Clip here to hold it in place if you felt insecure about it feeding in nicely. So to the edge, we'll angle off a bit. And now we're ready to turn that final corner. Now I'm working with kind of a small piece, so I'm just going to be careful to stitch this corner in, and then I'm going to stop so that I can line up my join here. So place that right in there. And because it's a small area, I'm going to do one little step ahead here. Now when you get close, a couple of inches away from where your join is about to happen, this is where I do definitely want to utilize a clip, or I don't really like to use pins with the serger, but you could use a pin just to hold that piece in place. There are a lot of different methods for joining the ends of your binding. Some people stitch them. I just kind of overlap. I'm also going to cut off some of my excess binding here just to get that right out of the way. And that way I can just tuck it right into my openings. Let me show you here. That's where I've got that opening. I'm going to tuck the next piece right in, and then I'm going to put another clip in just a little bit higher because I want everything to lay nice and flat. So you can see that's where my join is, and it's real important as you stitch to make sure that that lays nice and flat. So I use a few clips for my join here. Go. So I'm going to pull this one out before I come to it. Working with a stiletto can be really helpful for this too, because that'll help you to keep everything nice and flat. You can kind of use it as an extra hand. Make sure that folded edge doesn't get caught on the foot. And then I'm just going to overlap my stitching a little bit. Now this is a part where people get a little bit concerned with on sergers. How do I sew off without cutting off all those extra threads? Well, it's really, really easy. I like to overlap my stitches just a little bit, so I've already done that. I'm overlapping, say, 1/2 inch. And now I'm going to turn the hand wheel, lift my presser foot, and I'm going to literally pull on that needle thread to give me a little bit of slack. And then I can pull it all right out of the serger. Now, due to the nature of a serger stitch, the way that it knits those threads together, you can just trim that right off. It's nice and secure. Don't have to worry about it unraveling. I'm also going to be taking a little bit of time just to trim off all those extra thread tails that are in the corners because they're fusible. So if you accidentally were to touch one of these, you do have a piece of that fusible thread in the thread tail. So it's important to cut those off because that could stick to your iron. So I've got all 4 of those cut off. And now we're ready for the fun part. So here I've got a nice bound project. You can see that all 4 of my corners are nice and flat. And now we want to press this out. And then on the underside is where the fusible thread is at. So this entire area of stitching is actually basically like a glue at this point. Let me see if I can get a nice zoom for you there. There we go. So see how the thread wraps back and forth over itself? That has put down a nice layer of that adhesive thread. So what I like to do is just press my folded edge of my binding over the edge, and I line up that folded edge right with the edge of the fusible thread. And then you're just going to give it a press with your iron. So I'm going to hold it in place, and of course, when you're working with a small project like this, it can be helpful to put some clips in just to kind of, again, act like an extra set of hands. Just kind of hold that in place a little bit. And now I'm going to bring up my iron. So I've got everything laying nice and flat. And then, dun, 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 here comes the big iron. You just want to press it down, and you're just going to hold it for a little bit. You can follow the instructions from your fusible thread. I'm going to pull out this clip, give it a nice firm hold. Now maybe I'll come down this way just a little bit further. There we go. And now we're just about ready to get into that corner. So I'm going to iron right across the corner here. Just like that. Be careful not to touch your iron to the part that hasn't been covered with fabric yet, because that'll make for a gluey iron. So I've got a nice crisp first half of my corner. See how it's laying nice and flat? Now I'm going to fold it over itself just to miter that corner and then start working down the next edge. So I've got it and I'm kind of holding it. I'll show it to you in just a second here. So we're going to secure that corner, start working down the next side. There we go. And now as you can see, I've got one whole edge held in place. So everything's nice and straight, and I've got a nice corner. See how it mitered really nicely. And then when we look at the front side, it looks nice and straight here too. Got a mitered corner, nice even binding. And at that point, you are ready to take this to the sewing machine, or you could use your hand stitch, whichever is your preference, to stitch that down. Now, the glue on the fusible thread, it holds for a little while. You might be surprised to know that some of my quilts on Love of Quilting actually have a glued in place binding, because sometimes I run out of time. So they hold pretty well for a little while, but if you're going to end up washing the project, you definitely want to make sure that you take the time to use a little whip stitch. You could do a blanket stitch. I love playing with decorative stitches on my sewing machine to attach those bindings, and then you can end up with a really fun kind of custom look. You'll find that some of your decorative stitches might match the motif of your quilt blocks. So I hope that you've enjoyed this little lesson about serger bindings. It gives you a really nice flat binding. It feels just as good as any binding that I've sewn on my sewing machine. And I love that that fusible thread just makes that last step of the binding process just a bit easier and faster for me. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you again soon.